Lee's defeat was one of two heavy blows to the Confederacy. In the West, the loss of Vicksburg gave the Union control of the Mississippi and cut the Confederacy in two. Lee understood what had happened and offered his resignation to Jefferson Davis, who rejected it. Gettysburg had been the most deadly battle ever fought in North America. On November 19, 1863, Lincoln delivered a short speech to dedicate part of the battlefield as a cemetery. He spoke for only a few short minutes, but his words stirred the nation.
77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. From these honored dead, we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain. That this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom. And that the government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
If the South won, Lincoln implied, the great American experiment in democracy would end. American freedom would end. The Union must persevere. While events at Gettysburg were changing the course of the war in the East, out west, General Ulysses S. Grant was winning hard-fought Union victories. Unconditional surrender Grant, they called him, after he had refused to accept anything but an immediate and unconditional surrender. All through the winter of 1862 and 63, he had laid siege to the town of Vicksburg, the last Confederate stronghold on the Mississippi River. On July 4th, 1863, the Confederates finally surrendered.
Yesterday, we rode on the pinnacle of success. Today, absolute ruin seems to be our portion. The Confederacy taught us to its destruction.
Farther west, Indian nations were also becoming entangled in the war. White settlers continued to move into Indian territories, disregarding treaties and promises. The North was also eager to bring Western territories into the Union as free states and worried that Confederates were luring Native Americans to fight for the South.
And it is an interesting story in that we don't usually think of Indians being slaveholders or indeed Indians lining up with the Confederacy. You'd say, why wouldn't Native Americans line up with freedom since they had so little of their own? Those Indians who had slaves, Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw owned slaves, not all of them, tended to line up with the Confederacy. Those who didn't, for a variety of reasons, might line up with the Union. Chiefs like Stan Wadey or Chief John Ross, they were generals, and they fought largely in the Western theater, although a few ended up here in the Eastern theater. But they looked to their own interest, as you would expect anybody to do during the war.
November 1864, Sand Creek, Colorado. Some 550 Southern Cheyenne and Arapaho Indians are camped along Sand Creek for the winter. Union soldiers had promised they would not harm them. Then, as the sun begins to rise, Colorado volunteers crashed into the village, shooting and yelling. Cheyenne chief Black Kettle frantically ties an American flag and white flag of peace to a long pole and hoists it up in front of his teepee. Ignoring the flags, the soldiers slaughter men, women, and children.
A war in the West was largely being prosecuted against various Indian groups by Union soldiers in the effort not just to secure the West for the Union during the Civil War, but the war became an occasion for people who wanted to push the Indians out. And so you had massacres, such as the Sand Creek Massacre, where efforts, in effect, to use the larger war to justify the annihilation of one's enemies.
Anti-Indian violence, like the massacre at Sand Creek, poisoned Indian-white relations. As the number of incidents increased, volunteer troops stepped up their activities to meet what they called the growing Indian threat. In March 1864, Abraham Lincoln appointed Ulysses S. Grant Lieutenant General, a post last held by George Washington. Grant now controlled the Union's 500,000 soldiers. Lincoln had, at long last, found the man he was looking for. Grant was tough, decisive, and unrelenting. Grant moved his army southward, inflicting heavy losses on the Confederates in his Wilderness Campaign. "Wherever Lee goes, I go," he vowed, as he mounted constant assaults on the Confederates.
People in the North were shocked at the losses after Cold Harbor. They were piling up bodies, literally. It was said at Cold Harbor you could walk from one end of the battlefield to the other across dead Union soldiers and your foot would never touch the ground, but it would be soaked in blood that would go all the way up to your knees. People in the North said, "What? We can't continue with this." But Grant knew that he must continue it because the only way to beat Lee was to destroy his army. And if you destroyed Lee's army, then you would destroy the last vestige of Southern resistance. And no Southerner would stand after Lee had fallen.
Grant wanted to strike a death blow, something that would break the spirit of the Confederacy. He gave William Tecumseh Sherman 100,000 troops and orders to march all the way to Atlanta. Sherman tore his way through the South, finally capturing and burning the city of Atlanta, the military supply and rail center of the Deep South.
As far as the eye could reach, the lurid flames of burning houses lit up the heavens. I could stand out on the veranda and for 2 or 3 miles watch the Yankees as they came on.
After Atlanta, he made the decision to cut himself off from just following another Confederate army and to move across the richest counties in the Confederacy. He had studied census materials to find out what are the richest counties, and he was going to go from Atlanta to the sea. He was going to cut, as he said, a bloody swath and devour everything in his path. If they couldn't eat it, living on their bellies, what the Confederacy had for them to take, then they would destroy it. And the purpose of this was to let every Southerner know, because even those not hit directly would learn, let every Southerner know that we can move at will. I can move an army across a state and you can't stop us. And if I can move it there, I can move it anywhere. I will destroy you. That's a modern concept of total war. It shocked people in the middle of the 19th century. It shocks people still, but it worked.
The fall of Atlanta cheered the public back home and helped Abraham Lincoln win re-election over Democrat George McClellan, his former commander-in-chief, who ran on a platform that denounced the war as a failure and called for a negotiated peace with the South. In early 1865, the last Confederate strongholds began to fall. Confederates abandoned Charleston, South Carolina, Petersburg, and Richmond, Virginia. Black soldiers were among the earliest troops to march through the cities.
I am 69 years old, but I feel as if I want but 16.
Then you are glad the Yankees are here?
Oh, child, I doesn't call you Yankees. I call you Jesus AIDS.
Close to 190,000 African Americans had served their country during the course of the war, 1/5 of the total.
Can those be men? The dead there are not to be pitied as much as some of the living. Walt Whitman.
A Union medical worker, Walt Whitman couldn't believe his eyes when he visited Fort Bell, a prison camp in Virginia. Thousands of Union troops starved or died of disease in Confederate prisons. In the North, Camp Morton was considered a model camp, but nearly 1,700 Confederates died there during the war. On April 9th, General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox, Virginia. 5 days later, on April 14, 1865, John Wilkes Booth shot President Abraham Lincoln at the Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. Cheering and flags joined the black banners and cries of Lincoln's mourners. After 4 years of fighting and the loss of more than 600,000 lives, the Civil War was finally over. The end of the war marked a major turning point in United States history. The war had stimulated industrialization and new ways of conducting business. African Americans had won freedom. Native Americans lost ground in the West. The American South was devastated, its economy shattered, its towns and cities in ruins. Remaining before the nation lay new challenges, some of them as complicated and controversial as the war itself. Under what terms should the Southern states be readmitted to the Union? Should they be forgiven or punished? Now that the nation had abolished slavery, what should become of the 3.5 million African Americans released from bondage?